Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She texted her aunt, "I don't think this trip was a good idea anymore." Less than 8 hours later, resort staff found her lifeless body behind a locked service door. Her boyfriend was beside her, covered in her blood, sound asleep. This is the case of Kiara Agnew, and this is what happens when justice leaves quietly through the back door. March 3rd, 2023. Playa del Carmen, Mexico. A resort technician named Julio Torres was performing his usual morning rounds on the second floor of the Ocean Riviera Paradise Resort. At 9:42 a.m., he noticed the metal door to the utility corridor, the one that connected the laundry area to the service stairwell, was slightly ajar, and the red "Maintenance-Only" placard was hanging crooked. Resort protocol required that all internal access areas remain locked when not in use. Julio pushed it open. Inside, he found a woman lying motionless on her back, her arms stiff, bent awkwardly at the elbows. She wasn't breathing. There was a pool of blood behind her head that had partially dried. A man, face down, shirtless, was lying about 4 feet away, his torso stained red. Julio froze. He didn't touch anything. He backed out slowly and called security on his walkie. By 9:55 a.m., the resort's head of security had already placed the emergency call equivalent to 911. Local paramedics and state police arrived within 20 minutes. By 10:30 a.m., the scene had been secured. The woman was declared deceased. The man was alive and breathing, but disoriented and unresponsive. Their Canadian passports were later confirmed at the front desk. Victim: Kiara Agnew, 23 years old. Male occupant: Ryan Friesen, 26, her boyfriend. At first glance, it didn't appear to be a robbery. Nothing was missing from the room they were staying in. There were no signs of forced entry to the service corridor. The door had been locked from the inside. According to resort logs, both guests had checked in 2 nights earlier. They were part of a birthday trip scheduled to stay for 4 nights, but Kiara never saw day 3. The story began unfolding quickly back home in Canada, particularly in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, where Kiara had worked as a banking associate. Her mother, aunt, and co-workers told the press she was energetic, loyal, and careful. Friends noted she had been excited about her upcoming 24th birthday, which was supposed to be celebrated on this very trip. Yet several people, including her supervisor, recalled that her tone had changed just days before she departed. Her aunt told Global News, "She texted me that something didn't feel right. She didn't explain much, but she said she had a bad feeling." The nature of the discovery raised flags almost immediately. Authorities at the scene noted Kiara had visible trauma to the head and upper face. Blood was present on the floor, wall, and even the storage shelves near the body. The man, identified as Ryan Friesen, had bruising along his knuckles and blood across his torso, face, and forearms. He was not restrained, nor did he appear to be under any immediate physical distress. Medical responders transported Ryan to a local facility for evaluation. Toxicology results would take several days, but at initial review, there were no signs of acute alcohol poisoning or narcotics. He had no visible injuries beyond minor swelling on his hands. There was no struggle in the main hotel room. It had been untouched. The maid service that morning had confirmed the beds were made, and none of the towels had been used that day. That meant both Kiara and Ryan had exited their room together during the night, or early morning, and entered the utility corridor willingly, or at least without public disturbance. What happened between that door closing and that body being found was now a matter of forensic reconstruction. By the afternoon of March 3rd, Mexican law enforcement had designated the case under the classification of feminicidio, a femicide-related homicide investigation. Ryan Friesen was taken into custody on suspicion, but no charges were filed at that stage. He remained under preventive detention. The only available surveillance footage provided partial context. The couple had been seen on resort cameras leaving the main lobby around 1:30 a.m. They appeared sober. They weren't fighting. Kiara was wearing a black tank top and shorts. Ryan had his hand on her lower back. Their demeanor didn't suggest conflict. That was the last time either of them was seen on camera, until she was found dead and he was asleep beside her. The forensics team began mapping the room. Blood spatter analysts documented medium-velocity impact patterns on the tile floor behind Kiara's head. There were small transfer stains on the shelving unit, The pattern suggested at least one downward motion with force. A partial swipe was found on a vertical surface, possibly from a hand or arm being dragged or braced. The distribution didn't indicate a fall from standing height. That distinction would become important. On her fingernails, technicians collected tissue residue. Beneath her left thumbnail was skin consistent with epithelial origin. Samples were sent for rapid DNA match. Meanwhile, a soft tissue fragment, possibly brain matter, was recovered from the floor 2 feet away from her body. It was not consistent with blunt force head trauma from a fall. It had directional spread. The next morning, local media began to pick up the story, but the information came out slowly, cautiously. Resort management issued a 2-line statement. "We are cooperating with authorities. Our thoughts are with the family of the deceased." But back in Canada, Kiara's family was demanding more than a statement. They wanted answers. As the story broke internationally, a single question echoed across every forum, every headline, and every phone call her family received. Why would a man sleep beside the body of a woman he just found injured, or worse, killed? Was it confusion, trauma, a blackout, or was it a cover story? Would someone truly black out next to the woman they loved? Or is that the first step in avoiding prosecution? When a victim is reduced to just a name in a file, the audience forgets she was ever real. But every data point in this case, every timestamp, blood trace, and swipe log, came from someone who had plans, who had people waiting on the other side of that trip. Kiara Agnew wasn't a statistic. She had been planning to turn 24. She didn't make it. Kiara was born and raised in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, a small Canadian town near the Alberta border. She worked as a service representative at a local credit union and lived with her aunt, who had helped raise her after her parents' separation. She had no criminal history, no behavioral red flags, and no mental health diagnoses on record. She was financially stable, had savings, and had earned enough vacation time to take a 4-day trip abroad. The trip to Mexico had been booked months in advance. According to email receipts recovered from her work account, it was intended as a joint birthday celebration, hers and her boyfriend Ryan Friesen's, who turned 26 weeks earlier. The booking was made through a Canadian travel site on January 9, 2023, with a departure date of March 1st. The return was set for March 5th. Credit card statements show that Kiara paid for the trip in full. The couple arrived at the Ocean Riviera Paradise Resort in Playa del Carmen at approximately 4:17 p.m. local time on March 1, 2023. Their check-in was confirmed via front desk logs. Their assigned room was located in the building closest to the beach, 3rd floor. It included a balcony view and was equipped with one electronic key card assigned to each guest. Hotel swipe logs later confirmed that both cards were used several times during the first 36 hours. There was no evidence of third-party access or additional copies made. On the evening of March 2nd, the night before her body was found, Kiara posted a short video to her private Instagram story. It was a slow pan of the resort pool lit up at night. No voiceover, no appearance of Ryan, no geotag, just ambient resort audio. Timestamp, 8:41 p.m. Roughly 2 hours later, she sent a short text to her aunt in Canada. The message read, "I don't know why I came. He's trying to be nice, but something just doesn't feel right." No response was received. The message remained unread until after her death. A full digital extraction from Kiara's phone was conducted post-mortem. The report shows no outgoing calls between 9 o'clock p.m. and 1:30 a.m. No emergency calls, no texts to friends. The last app opened was the phone's camera app, timestamped at 1:12 a.m. That photo, the blurry selfie recovered from her device, showed her face partially visible in a dim hallway. Behind her, a white wall, possibly the outer corridor of the service area. Investigators noted her expression appeared tense, but this remains speculative. The last confirmed movement of Kiara and Ryan as a couple occurred at 1:29 a.m. when surveillance cameras showed them exiting the elevator near the service corridor. There was no sign of struggle. No raised voices were reported by nearby guests. Security guards did not notice any disruption that night. That's where the digital trail ends, until her body was found just over 8 hours later. During interviews, Kiara's coworkers described her as reliable and emotionally balanced. There were no recent reports of workplace distress or interpersonal issues. One colleague recalled a comment made the week before her trip. She said she hoped the vacation would help them reconnect. I remember she looked unsure. Financially, there were no irregularities. Her bank account showed no suspicious activity, no cash withdrawals. Her debit and credit cards were found in her wallet, untouched. The toxicology report confirmed zero presence of alcohol, sedatives, or narcotics in her system at time of death. Everything on file, digital and behavioral, indicated that Kiara arrived at the resort as a functioning adult, engaged in routine travel with no plan for confrontation or self-harm. She packed 4 days' worth of clothes. She brought her favorite sandals. She had planned to be back at work the following Monday. From an investigative standpoint, this chapter matters for one critical reason. Victimology is not background filler. It's the baseline against which every forensic contradiction must be measured. Kiara's behavior leading up to the incident didn't suggest erratic decisions. She wasn't emotionally volatile. She wasn't intoxicated. There was no prior trauma recorded in her psychological or medical history. So when a clean timeline stops dead at 1:29 a.m. and a woman ends up dead in a service room with zero recorded digital activity in the hours before, law enforcement doesn't just ask what happened. They ask, why did the data go dark when she needed to be seen the most? There's a reason most homicides hinge on physical evidence. Stories can be rehearsed, alibis can be twisted, but blood doesn't improvise. By 11:15 a.m. on March 3, 2023, the utility corridor inside the Ocean Riviera Paradise had been sealed off. A forensic team from Quintana Roo's State Investigative Police arrived shortly after the initial responders. Their objective wasn't complex: document, collect, and preserve every trace from the space where a 23-year-old Canadian woman had been found unresponsive. The service room was narrow and poorly lit. Fluorescent tubes overhead flickered inconsistently. The body had already been declared deceased by medics. Kiara Agnew's position was supine, partially twisted, with visible trauma to the head and upper face. Her right arm extended slightly outward. Her legs were bent unnaturally. Blood had pooled behind her skull and was visible in two separate areas, one beneath the head and another smaller one under her left shoulder. The temperature inside the corridor was recorded at 78 degrees. No fans, no cooling system. This mattered because lividity had already set in. Investigators estimated time of death between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m. based on blood coagulation and body temperature alone. Crime scene photography showed a directional transfer pattern near a lower wall panel, consistent with either dragging or collapsing contact. Smears were minimal. No footwear impressions were lifted. No cast-off patterns on the ceiling. This suggested the trauma was inflicted at close range, with limited projectile motion. To the left of the victim, a shelf unit contained towels and cleaning products. The edge of one shelf showed a blood transfer mark, half-moon in shape. A closer inspection indicated hair strands embedded in the residue. These were later confirmed to be consistent with the victim's hair via mitochondrial DNA testing. The man found nearby, Ryan Friesen, was conscious but nonverbal when transported from the scene. His clothing was soaked in blood, including portions of his lower arms and neck. A swab collected from his fingernails revealed skin cells and blood consistent with Kiara's DNA profile. His own injuries were minor: bruising across both knuckles, a small abrasion on the left wrist, and slight swelling of the metacarpal area. No third-party DNA was recovered from the scene. The door to the corridor was electronic. Logs showed it was open once between 1:30 and 4 o'clock a.m. At precisely 1:41 a.m. The card used was assigned to room 3412, Kiara and Ryan's suite. One key detail was immediately noted by investigators. The room's door locked automatically. It had to be opened manually with a guest card or by staff override. The fact that the door was ajar when the technician found it raised questions. Had the suspect left and re-entered, or had he remained inside the entire time? No surveillance camera covered the inside of the service corridor. The nearest camera, located near the elevator, captured their approach but not their entry. Investigators recovered Kiara's cell phone from the couple's hotel room. It had not left the suite. According to the device's system logs, it was last used at 1:12 a.m., nearly 30 minutes before the service room was accessed. Her purse remained untouched on the nightstand. Her wallet, identification, and room key card were all accounted for. No valuables had been removed. The forensic unit ruled out robbery. The autopsy, performed by the Quintana Roo medical examiner later that week, revealed Kiara had sustained multiple blunt force impacts to the cranial region. The largest fracture, left parietal, measured 3.4 inches in length, and was consistent with trauma caused by an object or forceful contact with a hard surface. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes suggested possible strangulation or neck compression, though not conclusively fatal. No sexual assault evidence was found, no internal injuries below the diaphragm. Toxicology results showed no presence of sedatives, alcohol, or recreational drugs. The primary cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in fatal brain hemorrhage. The medical report categorized the manner of death as homicide, pending further criminal classification. No forensic anomalies were detected in the scene analysis. No altered blood patterns. No visible attempts at cleanup. If there was intent behind the act, it hadn't included any post-crime concealment. What stood out, both to investigators and later to experts in Canada, was the static nature of the scene. No movement, no scatter, no resistance. It was as if something happened very quickly, and then everything just stopped. The crime scene didn't need opinion. It presented its own facts. Kiara entered the corridor alive. She sustained trauma consistent with close-range force. Her blood and tissue were present on surfaces consistent with a single-location assault. The man who had been staying with her was found at the scene, uninjured, stained with her blood, and displaying hand injuries consistent with impact. The only question left at that stage was, what would the legal system in Mexico choose to do with that information? In many homicide investigations, physical evidence opens the case, but it's the legal process that decides whether justice actually moves forward. In Mexico, that process looks different, especially when it involves foreign nationals, resort jurisdictions, and the word feminicidio. On the morning of March 3, 2023, Ryan Friesen was taken into custody under the Mexican legal equivalent of preventive detention. He was transported from the resort to the municipal holding facility in Playa del Carmen, where authorities formally opened a case under the federal classification of suspected femicide. In Mexican criminal law, femicide refers to the intentional killing of a woman due to her gender, and it carries heavier investigative and sentencing protocols. At this point in the investigation, the evidence spoke clearly. The autopsy had confirmed multiple blunt force injuries. The blood patterns and tissue displacement at the scene were consistent with a single-location impact. DNA swabs linked Ryan to the biological materials found on and near the victim. The hotel's access log showed no entry by anyone else between 1:41 a.m. and the time Kiara's body was discovered. Her death occurred in a locked corridor, and the only other person found inside was him. Under most systems, this would lead directly to a formal charge. But Mexico requires that such charges be filed within a strict 48-hour window of arrest, unless an extension is granted by a judge. And in Ryan's case, that window passed. Court records later revealed that the prosecutor's office hesitated, not because there was no probable cause, but because they deemed the surveillance footage inconclusive. The single hallway camera showed the couple walking together without visible conflict. The absence of a camera inside the service room limited their ability to visually anchor the moment of attack. And without direct witness testimony or recorded confession, the case risked being dismissed for lack of prosecutorial foundation. So Ryan remained under investigation, but was never formally charged. He stayed in preventive detention for several weeks, but no indictment followed. He was released and permitted to return to Canada. Back in Dawson Creek, the news spread quickly, and with disbelief. Kiara's family learned of the release through local consular channels, not the court system. Media outlets across Canada picked up the story. National coverage intensified as reporters uncovered the forensic inconsistencies between the evidence collected and the legal outcome that followed. From a procedural standpoint, there were several friction points. First, the translation delays. The forensic reports, interviews, and medical examiner summaries required certified English translations to be used in further proceedings or cross-border documentation. These took time, and that delay played into the decision not to file immediate charges. Second, the jurisdictional limitations. Though the resort was private property, the crime scene fell under state law enforcement. Coordination between resort legal teams and police introduced logistical constraints. Not all surveillance footage was released at once. By the time all data had been reviewed, the procedural window had closed. Third, the classification of the incident as femicide placed additional requirements on the prosecution. The law demands a clear demonstration of motive rooted in gender violence. While physical evidence supported the finding of homicide, The legal burden for femicide requires context, prior history of abuse, documented threats, or motive tied to gender. In this case, no such prior evidence was found on file. By March 30, 2023, Ryan Friesen was no longer in Mexico. No extradition request was filed. The case remained open but inactive. For the Agnew family, the situation became a legal paradox. The physical evidence supported a violent death. The investigative work was complete. The suspect was known. But the legal framework, due to timing, documentation, and interpretation, meant the case could not proceed. From an international legal lens, this was not uncommon. Cases involving Canadians murdered abroad, particularly in tourist jurisdictions, often stall in local systems. Extradition is rare, and dual-country prosecution is even rarer unless the suspect is Canadian and the victim's death is tied to domestic abuse patterns traceable in Canada. That was not the case here. At a public level, however, the optics of a man found at a crime scene, covered in blood, alone with the victim, walking free without charges, ignited public backlash. Kiara's name began circulating in hashtags. Her family organized a formal vigil outside the Mexican consulate in Calgary. And yet, from a purely legal standpoint, the system had not failed. It had simply performed within the boundaries of local law. But those boundaries, defined by jurisdiction, timelines, and procedural burdens, left a very real family with no trial, no sentence, and no closure. There's an inherent tension in any legal system between what is obvious and what is admissible, between what's known and what's provable. And this case, by every measure, stood right at that line. The Mexican authorities had faced scrutiny before, but this case quickly escalated beyond their borders. A young Canadian woman found dead in a luxury resort room in Playa del Carmen with her boyfriend, Ryan Friesen, as the sole companion on the trip, triggered not just a local homicide inquiry but a wave of diplomatic, forensic, and international media pressure. By the second week of March 2023, this was no longer just a suspicious death. It was a case with international implications. The forensic team in Quintana Roo worked in tandem with Canadian law enforcement liaisons. According to the preliminary autopsy report, Kiara Agnew died of asphyxia due to manual strangulation. No toxic substances were found in her system. The medical examiner noted petechiae in both eyes, consistent with sustained pressure to the neck. Bruising on her arms and signs of blunt force trauma to the back of the head suggested a struggle before death. The time of death was estimated to be between 10:30 p.m. and midnight on March 2, 2023. Inside the hotel room at the Grand Sunset Princess Resort, investigators cataloged the evidence: blood smears on the bed sheets, a shattered wine glass, Kiara's smartwatch forcibly removed and found beneath the dresser. Her phone had no recent messages after 10:08 p.m. despite previously frequent activity throughout the evening. No signs of forced entry, no third-party DNA. The room was locked from the inside with a digital key card. Resort security logs showed only 2 entries: Kiara and Ryan. Ryan Friesen had been detained at the scene. Security was alerted by another guest who heard shouting and thuds from the neighboring room. When security entered at 1:27 a.m., Ryan appeared intoxicated, with dried blood on his knuckles and shirt. He offered no clear explanation for Kiara's condition, only repeating that something went wrong. He was arrested under suspicion of femicide, a term under Mexican criminal law used specifically when a woman is killed due to her gender, often by an intimate partner. Interviews with hotel staff revealed that Kiara and Ryan had been seen arguing earlier that night at the resort bar. One server recalled Kiara appearing visibly upset. Another guest reported hearing a door slam and a woman crying through the adjoining wall. Back in British Columbia, the RCMP launched a parallel investigation to support the Mexican authorities. Ryan Friesen, age 26, had no prior criminal record, but his digital history raised concerns. Police obtained a warrant for his social media, email, and private messaging platforms. What they found was alarming. Several months' worth of controlling behavior, obsessive jealousy, and escalating messages questioning Kiara's movements, friendships, and even clothing choices. Notably, in late February, days before the trip, Ryan had sent a message to a friend stating, "If she tries to leave me down there, she won't get far." Though it could be read ambiguously in light of Kiara's death, it became a key red flag in the psychological profile investigators were building. Authorities also interviewed Kiara's co-workers at the Dawson Creek Credit Union. They described her as vibrant, compassionate, and ambitious. She had confided in at least 2 colleagues about concerns regarding Ryan's temper and his reaction when she mentioned possibly taking a break. One coworker stated, "She wasn't scared of him, just tired. She didn't want drama but felt smothered." The digital footprint didn't lie. A pattern emerged: emotional volatility, gaslighting, periods of silence followed by intense love bombing. It painted a portrait of coercive control, a dynamic too often invisible until it's fatal. At the Canadian consulate in Mexico, family members arrived to identify the body. Kiara's mother, distraught, was given access to her daughter's belongings. Among them was a partially written journal entry in a pocket notebook. The final lines read, "I hope this trip clears things. I want peace. I want to feel like myself again." That notebook was passed to investigators. It wasn't hard evidence, but it was context, a lens into her mindset in those final hours. As Ryan remained in custody in Playa del Carmen, the legal process began moving forward. The case was now formally listed as a femicide under Mexican law, a classification that changes how evidence is weighed and how trial proceedings unfold. If convicted, Ryan faced up to 50 years in a Mexican prison. But for now, there was no formal confession, no clear motive admitted by the suspect, only a tight web of circumstantial and forensic evidence growing heavier by the day. By late March 2023, the Canadian media had fully mobilized. News outlets released photographs of Kiara and Ryan, reports from the scene, and interview clips from her grieving family. Public interest soared. Advocacy groups began using the case as a focal point for discussions about dating violence and the dangers of coercive relationships, especially for young women abroad. Kiara's story, once personal, was now public, a cautionary tale. But beneath that public narrative was still a cold case file moving step by step toward legal resolution. And for the investigators, the question remained clear and sharp. What would Ryan say when finally forced to explain what happened between 10:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. in that locked room? By the morning of March 11, 2023, the Playa del Carmen resort had shifted from luxury retreat to active crime scene. The tourist activities continued in the background, but behind sealed doors, Mexican authorities were coordinating the next phase of the investigation, a full forensic autopsy. Kiara Agnew's body had been transferred to a facility in Cancun, where a certified medical examiner performed the post-mortem examination. The purpose wasn't closure, it was evidence. The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation by manual strangulation. There was no ambiguity. Bruising patterns on the anterior and lateral aspects of the neck matched the shape and pressure of human hands. Petechial hemorrhages were found in both eyes, a classic indicator of restricted airflow due to force. In addition, the examiner recorded multiple contusions on her scalp, suggesting she had been struck or had made forceful contact with a blunt surface. The toxicology screen came back negative. No drugs, no alcohol. This detail narrowed the scope of theories dramatically. She hadn't overdosed. She wasn't intoxicated. She hadn't slipped and fallen. This was no accident. The estimated time of death was between 11:30 p.m. on March 9th and 4 a.m. on March 10th, coinciding with the window in which both Kiara and her boyfriend Ryan Friesen were last seen by resort staff and guests. Surveillance footage from the resort filled in further blanks. At 10:52 p.m., Kiara and Ryan were captured exiting the resort bar together. According to later interviews, their interactions had been tense. Several guests reported hearing raised voices during dinner. At 11:11 p.m., a hallway camera recorded Ryan walking alone toward their room. Kiara was not seen again after that point. Just after 5 a.m., a resort security officer found Ryan disoriented, sitting on the hallway floor. He appeared to be under emotional distress. Notably, his hands were visibly stained, later determined to be blood. Officers responding to the scene entered the couple's room and found Kiara deceased, partially covered by a sheet on the floor near the bed. The scene showed no signs of forced entry or prolonged struggle. Furniture was intact. No objects had been thrown or broken. There was blood present, but not enough to suggest the use of a weapon. Her phone was recovered from the floor with a cracked screen, and later analysis confirmed it was hers. Ryan's fingerprints were the only ones found on the screen and on both glasses on the nightstand. Keycard logs from the resort's digital entry system confirmed that only Ryan's card was used to access the room between 11:00 p.m. and the time of police arrival. All entries and exits were digitally timestamped. On March 11th, the Quintana Roo State Prosecutor's Office issued a public statement indicating that a Canadian citizen had been arrested in connection with the death of another Canadian national. While they did not initially release names, Canadian outlets identified the individuals based on confirmations from family members. The victim was 23-year-old Kiara Agnew from Dawson Creek, British Columbia, and the man in custody was her boyfriend, Ryan Friesen, 26, also from Dawson Creek. Authorities classified the investigation under feminicidio, Mexico's legal term for femicide, the killing of a woman specifically due to gender-based violence. This classification brought additional scrutiny. Under Mexican law, femicide charges carry heavier penalties and require prosecutors to demonstrate specific intent or gendered motive behind the killing. The evidentiary threshold is high, but in this case, the autopsy and digital evidence painted a stark, consistent timeline that aligned with witness reports. At home in Canada, Kiara's death triggered a national conversation. Her family described her as ambitious, compassionate, and full of promise. She had been excited for the trip, a short vacation to celebrate life, not end it. In early April, the family organized protests outside the Mexican consulate in British Columbia. Their message was simple. They wanted answers, and they wanted them transparently. The media picked up on the unique complexities of the case. It involved international jurisdiction, gender-based violence, and a suspect being held abroad. Many Canadians were unfamiliar with the legal process in Mexico, particularly the application of femicide statutes. The public backlash grew louder when early reports indicated that Ryan Friesen was being held without formal charges pending. Although the evidence gathered so far strongly suggested homicide, the next step, formal indictment, required precise legal coordination. Meanwhile, Mexican prosecutors continued to compile supporting documentation, forensic pathology reports, biometric records from the hotel, expert testimony on the bruising patterns, and statements from witnesses both at the resort and back in Canada who knew the couple. Still, a clear motive had not been disclosed. There was no known history of domestic violence on record, no protection orders, no prior police contact. But the absence of formal history did not negate the forensic findings, nor did it change the digital footprint left behind. This chapter in the case served as a pivot. The initial shock of discovery had passed. The narrative had moved out of speculation and into concrete forensic territory. The evidence was physical, time-stamped, and interconnected. While the public would continue to ask why this happened, the authorities were now focused on what they could prove and how. The upcoming phase would be shaped not by emotion or public opinion, but by legal filings, courtroom procedures, and extradition laws. In the end, it wouldn't be grief or outrage that determined the outcome. It would be evidence. The autopsy left little room for ambiguity. Manual strangulation, petechial hemorrhaging, defensive bruising. It was clinical confirmation of what was increasingly evident from the scene and timeline. But confirmation wasn't enough. The next step had to come from the legal framework, and Mexico's response would determine how this international case progressed. On March 13, 2023, Mexican prosecutors issued a formal declaration. Ryan Friesen would remain in detention under preventive custody, as permitted by Mexico's judicial system for suspects in homicide cases. He was not released on bail. The Quintana Roo State Prosecutor's Office upgraded the case classification from general homicide to feminicidio agravado, an aggravated form of femicide that implies premeditation or brutality against a woman based on gender. The shift was not symbolic. Under Mexican law, femicide carries heavier sentencing guidelines and elevates the burden of proof on prosecutors to show not only intent, but also a motive connected to gender-based hostility or systemic patterns. But authorities believed the case met that threshold. The evidence submitted to support preventive detention included post-mortem findings linking cause of death to deliberate force, digital keycard logs showing Ryan was the only person to enter the room after 11 p.m., surveillance video confirming no third-party involvement, trace evidence, blood, partial fingerprints, connecting Ryan to the scene, eyewitness statements from hotel staff confirming earlier arguments. Inside the detention center in Playa del Carmen, Friesen's initial responses during the interrogation phase were described by investigators as inconsistent. He did not confess. He invoked confusion, memory loss, and emotional distress. No lawyer was present during the first voluntary statements, but he was assigned legal representation shortly after the formal arrest process began. At this stage, investigators focused less on narrative and more on reconstruction. Using time-stamped data, phone metadata, and physical indicators at the scene, forensic analysts built a minute-by-minute map of the estimated timeline between 10:45 p.m. and 5 o'clock a.m. This map became the spine of the prosecution's file. Despite the presence of motive markers, jealousy, tension, controlling behavior, there was no written confession, no phone recording, no suicide note, no journal. In that absence, the prosecution's case leaned heavily on forensic coherence. Every keycard entry, every log timestamp, and every mark on Kiara's body formed a sequence that Mexico's court system recognized as circumstantial, but converging beyond reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, Canadian consular officials in Mexico began formal communication with Kiara Agnew's family. The family demanded repatriation of her remains and transparency in the legal process. They were not convinced Mexican authorities would act swiftly, and they feared that the complexity of international law might lead to delays, or worse, a procedural failure. In Dawson Creek, British Columbia, local vigils grew into coordinated demonstrations. Posters with Kiara's image were taped to the windows of the Mexican consulate in Vancouver. Her parents, visibly distressed, addressed Canadian media. They questioned why no prior red flags had been documented. But publicly, the RCMP in British Columbia offered no insight. Ryan Friesen had no prior arrests, no known psychiatric evaluations, and no reported history of domestic violence. The lack of documented abuse doesn't mean abuse didn't exist. It simply meant there were no prior interventions that might have prevented the outcome. That reality complicated public discussion. Without a documented history, the killing was not easily classified into familiar patterns. Prosecutors in Mexico emphasized the physical evidence over psychological profiling, staying within the strict scope of femicide legislation. As of April 2023, Ryan Friesen remained in pretrial detention. No plea had been entered. The formal trial was yet to be scheduled. Under Mexican law, suspects can be held for up to 2 years before trial begins if charges are serious and evidence supports continued detention. Canadian media began requesting extradition updates, but since the crime occurred on Mexican soil and the charges were under Mexican jurisdiction, extradition was neither necessary nor likely. The defense team, appointed by the Mexican public legal system, made no comment on their strategy. In similar cases, the defense may argue diminished capacity or lack of intent, but in this case, the nature of the injuries ruled out impulsive or accidental causes. There were no sudden twists in this chapter, just confirmation, step by step, that the case was progressing with increasing legal weight. While social media speculation continued, the prosecution remained clinical. The facts wouldn't speak emotionally, they would speak in court.